It was the year 1874, in the fog-laden outskirts of Whitby, a coastal town in northern England, where superstition clung to the damp air as tightly as the mist that rolled in from the North Sea. On the night of October 17th, under the pale glow of a fractured moon, a group of villagers stumbled upon something that would alter the course of their community forever. In the silence of the midnight hours, just beyond the ancient graveyard, a freshly dug mound of earth betrayed a burial that was not sanctioned by church or law. The ground was still warm from the labor of hurried hands, the soil unsettled, the air heavy with the metallic tang of blood that seemed to seep from beneath the earth itself. What they uncovered was not a funeral carried out in grief, but a secret interment done in fear, in darkness, and with a violence that reeked of something far more sinister than a simple crime. Before we journey deeper, I want to ask you, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it as you listen to this tale? Because time itself will matter here, and midnight, as you will see, holds its own dreadful power. Whitby was no stranger to death. Its cobblestone streets were lined with fishermen's cottages, its harbor filled with ships that carried not only goods, but whispered legends of spirits and sea-bound curses. The graveyard on the cliff had long been a place of uneasy reverence, its Gothic headstones leaning as if bowing to the ocean winds. But what the villagers encountered that October night unsettled even the most hardened among them. The burial was shallow, hurried, and at its center was a body mutilated beyond recognition, wrapped not in cloth but in strips of blackened, blood-soaked linen that bore strange symbols burned into the fabric. At first glance, it looked like ritual work, something out of the whispered stories of black magic that locals dismissed in daylight but feared when night fell. The corpse, a man perhaps in his 30s, bore deep gashes along his chest, and his mouth had been stuffed with earth, as though silenced even in death. Who had done this, and why at midnight? And more importantly, why had they chosen a place already sacred with the bones of centuries past? As word spread, fear gripped the town. Villagers locked their doors earlier, candles burned through the night, and whispers spread that the burial was no mere crime, it was an offering. Some said the man had been a stranger, others whispered he was one of their own. The local constable, a stern and skeptical man named Edward Harrow, dismissed the murmurs of witchcraft and insisted it was a brutal murder, the kind that men commit for greed or vengeance. But Harrow had no answers for the strange sigils on the cloth, or for the reports of ghostly figures seen wandering the graveyard in the days leading up to the discovery. He tried to silence the talk of black magic, yet even he could not explain why. In the following nights, villagers began hearing screams carried on the wind, screams that seemed to come from beneath the very ground itself. Was it imagination, fed by fear, or was the midnight burial the opening act of something that defied reason? And if so, what secrets did the earth of Whitby conceal, waiting for those brave or foolish enough to dig deeper? The investigation began the very next morning, though the mist had yet to lift from the cliffs, and the air carried that same strange metallic scent that clung to the burial site like an invisible shroud. Constable Edward Harrow stood over the shallow grave with his lantern raised, his boots sinking into the damp soil. Around him, villagers gathered at a distance, crossing themselves or muttering half-prayers, unwilling to step closer for fear of disturbing whatever curse might linger in the ground. Harrow's assistants carefully uncovered the body, placing it upon a rough wooden board so the town's physician could examine the wounds. Dr. Samuel Gray, a man whose knowledge of anatomy was as respected as it was feared, noted the brutality of the cuts, the deliberate carving across the chest that seemed less like an act of rage and more like ritualistic precision. Each wound followed a pattern, a design, as though the killer or killers had intended the mutilation to serve a purpose. The linen strips were collected, their symbols noted but not understood, for neither Harrow nor Gray could decipher their meaning. They appeared ancient, almost runic, burned into the cloth with an intensity that suggested fire and intent. "This is no robbery," Gray muttered under his breath, "nor a quarrel gone too far. This is something else entirely." The town council demanded swift answers, but the constable's efforts were frustrated at every turn. No one admitted to knowing the victim, though a few villagers claimed they had seen a stranger passing through days earlier, a gaunt man with pale skin and sunken eyes who kept to himself. Others swore the body belonged to Thomas Wren, a blacksmith's apprentice who had vanished 2 weeks prior after a quarrel with his master. Yet the disfigurement of the corpse made identification almost impossible, and even the missing teeth seemed to have been pulled deliberately, erasing another layer of recognition. The uncertainty fed the fires of fear, and whispers turned to accusations. Some villagers pointed to Martha Blythe, an old widow who lived on the edge of the moors and was long suspected of dabbling in charms and curses. Others muttered about sailors who brought strange books and darker practices from distant shores. But the most chilling rumor was that the burial was part of a pact and offering to something older than the church, something that demanded blood to be appeased. And always at the center of these whispers was the timing, midnight. Why was the body buried then, and what power did the darkness of that hour hold? Constable Harrow tried to quiet these suspicions, but even he was not immune to the unease that crept into Whitby. The evidence began to grow more unsettling the deeper he looked. Days after the discovery, Gray returned with findings that made his voice tremble despite his practiced composure. The victim's heart had been removed not crudely, but with surgical precision, as though the killer possessed knowledge of anatomy far beyond the common man. Stranger still, traces of candle wax were found in the victim's hair and on his hands, suggesting the murder took place not in some hurried alleyway attack, but within a ritual setting. A lantern discovered near the grave bore markings identical to those on the linen, as if it too had been part of the ceremony. Harrow knew he could no longer dismiss the villagers' claims of black magic, though he dared not admit it aloud. Then came the testimony's accounts of a cloaked figure seen wandering the cliffs at night, of spectral lights floating among the graves, of dogs howling as though warning of something unseen. Children whispered of hearing scratching beneath the soil while their parents prayed more fervently at night. Each new account deepened the divide between rational explanation and the creeping dread that the burial was not merely the aftermath of murder, but the beginning of something much darker. And as Harrow stood in his office late one evening, staring at the symbols etched into the cloth, he could not shake the thought: had this killing been meant to summon something? Or worse, had it been meant to bury it? As the days turned into weeks, Whitby seemed to darken with a weight that was not just of autumn but of something unspoken, a pall that settled over the town as though the midnight burial had awakened a shadow that refused to return to rest. Constable Harrow pressed forward with his inquiries, tracing every possible lead with a determination that bordered on desperation. He began with the widow Martha Blythe, whose reputation for superstition had long been the subject of town gossip. Her home, a crooked stone cottage surrounded by overgrown thorns, reeked of herbs and smoke, and when Harrow entered, he found crude carvings etched into the wooden beams, symbols that bore a striking resemblance to those burned into the burial cloth. Martha denied involvement in the murder, her pale eyes flashing with indignation, yet she did not shy away from admitting her knowledge of such markings. They were, she explained in her hoarse voice, protective wards meant to guard against restless spirits and wandering curses. When Harrow pressed her on the meaning of the burial, she grew quiet, then whispered words that would haunt him. Midnight is when the veil thins. What they buried was not meant to stay buried. Whether it was madness, superstition, or a kernel of truth, Harrow left her cottage more unsettled than he cared to admit. Meanwhile, the body itself refused to yield its identity. Despite notices sent to neighboring towns, no one came forward to claim the victim. Dr. Gray's continued examinations revealed new horrors. Faint traces of soot inside the lungs, suggesting the man had been alive during at least part of the ritual, his final breaths choked by smoke and ash. His fingernails were broken, soil embedded deep beneath them, pointing to a desperate struggle to claw his way out of the earth once buried. That detail, when leaked, spread through Whitby like wildfire, fueling tales that the man had been buried alive as part of a ceremony that demanded not only death but suffering. Villagers whispered that they now heard scratching from beneath the ground when they passed the graveyard at night, and some refused to walk near it altogether. Fear transformed into ritual behavior. Salt was sprinkled across thresholds, crucifixes hammered into doors, and candles left burning until dawn. But none of it seemed to quiet the dread that midnight brought. When the church bell struck 12 and shadows grew longer, darker, more sinister, Harrow, though outwardly stoic, began sleeping less. And he kept his revolver at his side, though in his heart he doubted bullets would protect him from whatever truth lay hidden beneath Whitby's soil. The investigation reached a turning point when a sailor named Jacob Finch came forward, his weathered face pale as he confessed to seeing something on the night of October 17th. He had been walking back from the harbor after a late unloading when he glimpsed lantern light flickering in the graveyard. Curious but cautious, he had hidden behind the leaning stones and watched. There were 3 figures, cloaked and hooded, working with frantic precision to lower the mutilated man into the shallow pit. They spoke in whispers he could not understand, a language harsh and guttural, yet he was certain it was not English. One of the figures held a book, bound in what looked like black leather, reading aloud as the others shoveled dirt over the body. Finch admitted he fled before the ritual ended, too terrified to see more. But his account was enough to confirm Harrow's darkest suspicion. This was not the act of one murderer, but of a group, a coven perhaps, or a secret society, practicing rites long buried by civilized memory. The revelation widened the scope of the case, but narrowed its comfort. For if there were several involved, then they walked still among the townsfolk, unseen, their identities hidden by ordinary faces by day and cloaks by night. And if the burial had been deliberate ritual, then the question remained, what had they hoped to awaken or conceal with their midnight work? Constable Harrow could no longer dismiss the evidence as superstition or coincidence. Jacob Finch's testimony confirmed what Harrow feared, but could not yet prove that Whitby harbored a hidden circle of men and women practicing something far darker than law or scripture could account for. He ordered nightly patrols along the graveyard and cliffs, though few of his men volunteered willingly. Lanterns swung in the fog like restless stars, boots crunched on the damp soil, yet nothing was seen in those hours except the silhouettes of crows and the shifting mist. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted. Harrow himself began spending nights in his office, poring over the recovered strips of cloth and the lantern marked with sigils. A visiting scholar from York, one Elias Thorncroft, was summoned to examine them. Thorncroft, thin and severe, specialized in medieval texts and was quick to recognize fragments of the markings. They were not random, but derived from an archaic alphabet once associated with heretical sects in the 15th century. The words suggested invocation pleas or commands directed not toward God but toward forces unnamed. Thorncroft's assessment chilled Harrow. They believed midnight was a threshold. Constable, a burial at that hour was not meant to end life, but to bind something, or to release it. Meanwhile, Whitby itself seemed to unravel beneath the weight of terror. Rumors of ghostly figures in the graveyard multiplied, and several families claimed to hear scratching beneath their floors at night. Livestock were found slaughtered in fields at dawn, their throats slit with surgical neatness, their blood drained into the earth. Each fresh horror was linked, in the villagers' minds, to the burial. The church, overwhelmed, held nightly vigils, but attendance dwindled as prayers seemed to yield no relief. Fear turned inward, and suspicion poisoned relationships. Neighbors accused one another of harboring knowledge of the ritual. Old feuds resurfaced with accusations of witchcraft. The widow Martha Blythe was dragged before the council once more, though she swore her innocence. "You hunt me because I am old and alone," she cried. "But the true hunters walk among you still." Her words rang true enough that Harrow himself intervened, preventing her from being harmed, though doubt festered in his mind. If Martha had not been among those cloaked figures, then who had, and how many? The investigation was a labyrinth, each clue a twisting corridor, leading not to clarity, but to further dread. Then came the discovery that pushed Whitby from fear into full hysteria. Weeks after the first burial, Another shallow grave was found, this time in the marshlands beyond the cliffs, uncovered by heavy rains. The body was a young woman no older than 20, her hair matted with blood, her limbs bent at unnatural angles as though deliberately broken. Her heart too was missing, her mouth packed with stones instead of earth, and upon her pale skin were carved the same symbols seen before. This time, though, a necklace was found still clasped around her neck, a silver cross engraved with the name Eliza Carter. Unlike the faceless stranger before, this victim was no outsider but a known villager, daughter of a fisherman and once seen laughing among friends in the harbor streets. The effect of her death was catastrophic. Panic erupted, for if Eliza could be taken, mutilated, and buried in darkness, then none was safe. Her parents wept in the streets. The townsfolk demanded action, and Harrow knew the killers had escalated their crimes into something deliberate, targeted, and unstoppable. And when Thorncroft examined the fresh markings upon her body, he declared them clearer, sharper, as though the ritual was perfecting itself. "This is no series of accidents," he told Harrow grimly. "This is a progression. They are building towards something, and the final act, I fear, has not yet come." The clock was ticking, and once more all eyes turned to midnight, the hour when the veil thinned, when dirt was unsettled, and when the living and the dead seemed to touch hands in the dark. The second body shifted everything. Whitby transformed from a quiet, haunted town into a place where panic walked the streets openly. Doors slammed at dusk, mothers clutched their children close, and the once bustling harbor seemed drained of its life. Yet beneath the fear was something sharper, suspicion that the killers were not strangers at all, but neighbors. Harrow tightened his patrols and interrogated anyone known to be awake during the nights of the burials. The widow Martha Blythe, though innocent by his judgment, gave him a chilling lead. She spoke of a group known in whispers as the Circle of Ash, descendants of old families who once practiced rites forbidden by church and crown alike. According to her, their rituals demanded blood to bind the living and the dead, and the missing hearts were offerings meant to feed something that lingered between worlds. Harrow dismissed the story publicly, but in private he began tracing lineages, looking for connections between Whitby's most ordinary families and the names Martha gave him. What he uncovered was not proof, but suggestion several families had ancestors tied to heresy trials in the 15th century, and their descendants still lived among them. It was enough to make Harrow's blood run cold. Then, on the night of November 12th, the final act arrived. The church bell tolled midnight, and a patrolman stumbled into Harrow's office, pale and gasping, declaring that lantern light flickered once more in the graveyard. Harrow seized his revolver, rallied his men, and raced through the fog. There, among the leaning Gothic stones, they saw it. 3 cloaked figures standing over a freshly dug pit, their hands stained with blood, their voices chanting in that same guttural language Jacob Finch had described. At their feet lay another body, not yet buried, this one still twitching, alive, bound in ropes, eyes wide with terror. It was Thomas Wren, the blacksmith's missing apprentice, beaten but breathing. Harrow gave the order, and his men surged forward. Chaos erupted. The cloaked figures fled into the fog, abandoning their ritual, but not before one turned to face Harrow. Beneath the hood was a face he knew, Elias Thorncroft, the very scholar who had claimed to help with the investigation. His eyes were fever-bright, his mouth twisted into a grin as he hissed, "You cannot stop what has already begun." Then he vanished into the night, swallowed by the mist. Thomas Wren was pulled from the pit, his body broken but alive, his heart still intact. Through cracked lips he spoke of being taken by Thorncroft and others, forced to witness rites in hidden cellars, threatened with burial if he resisted. His account confirmed what Harrow dreaded. The Circle of Ash was real, its members concealed within Whitby's own society, and Thorncroft was only one of many. In the days that followed, patrols combed the countryside, but no further captures were made. The town tried to return to life, but the damage lingered. Eliza Carter's family left Whitby, unable to live where her blood had been spilled. Martha Blythe disappeared one morning, her cottage abandoned, its carvings burnt from the beams, and at the edge of the graveyard, the disturbed earth of that first midnight burial remained unsettled, as though something beneath still shifted, restless, waiting. Harrow wrote his reports, filed his findings, and spoke only of men, not demons, but in the solitude of his nights, he could not forget Thorncroft's final words, nor the sensation that Whitby itself had been marked by something older, darker, and patient. And so the question lingers, was the midnight burial merely the work of men corrupted by belief, or had they succeeded, if only briefly, in calling forth something unspeakable from beyond the veil? The graves remain, the stories endure, and the sea winds still carry whispers through Whitby streets when the hour strikes 12. Tell me, if you stood there on that cliffside at midnight, would you dare to listen closely to the soil, or would you flee before the scratching beneath the earth grew louder? If this story gripped you, join us again for the next ascent into darkness. Subscribe to Dark History HD. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this with others who crave the shadows of forgotten crimes. Until then, remember, not every burial is meant to rest in peace.